Checking 1, 1, 1. Good morning. Y'all are going to have to look on up this morning because I am going to be standing up here. It is the microphone that is working. So it's a pleasure to see each of you here this weekend. I hope you have had a safe weekend so far. It's a long one for all of us, and those who may be traveling or have friends and family traveling, we pray for a safe journey for everyone. This morning we're continuing our study in the book of Romans, and we have arrived at one, maybe two, of the more complex chapters in this book. Man, it took me a while, and I'm not there yet, but even to get a grasp enough to stand before y'all this morning with any sort of logical sense to this chapter. It's a lot about the law, and in one of the commentaries that I use a good bit, Jimmy Allen, when he teaches this class at Harding, when he used to teach this class at Harding, he said when he got to this part, he had all of the students write down that verse in Peter, where Peter says, Paul says some things sometimes that are hard to understand. He said, so we wanted to be sure that everyone knew that's where we were headed. But I think that one of the things when we read the book of Romans, especially this chapter, it gives us insight that the Spirit who was guiding all of those writers of the Scriptures. We know that all Scripture is inspired by Spirit. But the Spirit did not turn these guys into robots and just sit there and spill out information. If that had been the case, then every book in the Bible would sound exactly the same, like it was written by the same person. And it's not. Paul's writings are much different from Peter's writings or from Luke's writings or John. You can tell by their style of writing. So the personalities of the writers of these books were very much involved, even though the information that they got was in fact given to them through inspiration. So that being said, we will begin with chapter 7 this morning. So a continuation of chapter 6, as we've mentioned so many times, chapters and verses were not in the original writings. They were just written. So when we stop and make a thought, it's not really a break in the idea. It's a continuation of the idea. So verse 7, chapter 7, verse 1 starts saying, "Or do you not know, brethren, for I am speaking of those who know the law, that the law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives." Now then, speaking to those who know the law, the article "the" is not necessarily in the original transcript, okay? So I'm speaking to those who know law, that law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives. So we're not necessarily talking about the law of Moses. He's just saying, for those of you who know law, you know that the law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives. For the married woman is bound by law, see, not by the law. I'm reading from New American Standard, okay? The married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning the husband. So then, if while her husband is living she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man. Now then, If we want to read about divorce and all of this kind of stuff, we can go to Corinthians, okay? This section is not about divorce or couples splitting up and a woman being called an adulteress if she goes and has an affair or whatever. That's not what this section is about. It's about being free from the law, okay? That's what Paul is talking about. He's using that analogy because he is speaking to those who know law. Okay, if you know the law, then you know this scenario that you're not supposed to split up, and if your wife goes and lives with another man, she's breaking the law. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. However, it is interesting, I think, that one of the closest relationships that people have in this world is husband and wife, okay? They become one flesh. They become one. And this example or this analogy is used so much in the scriptures. What is the church? How is the church referred to Jesus? Okay, as a bride, and he being the bridegroom. So we see this analogy, and as Paul talked about earlier, through the obedience of baptism and following God's command of baptism, that's how we become united with Christ. That's how we become one with Christ. So this analogy of husband and wife is used a lot. What about the book of Hosea? There's a story there about a wife leaving her husband, and the example is that God is saying that the children of Israel, y'all were like an adulterous wife. Y'all left me. We were united. I was your God, but you left me. And so you're considered just like one who is left. So anyway, I just find it ironic or uncanny or unique or one of those words that the Jews were considered unfaithful to God. And this is the example that Paul is using. Okay, everybody with me on that one? Questions, comments? Okay, I won't go there. We'll leave something else. So verse 4 says, "Therefore, my brethren, you were also made to die to the law through the body of Christ, that you might be joined to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we might bear fruit from God." So he says, in regard to the law, you were made to die to the law. How? They were buried in baptism, number one, brought to a new life, dead to the law, new to the body, the church, the body, the bridegroom of Christ. So we see that they died to the law. Why? They died through the body of Christ. For what reason? That you may, I'm sorry, go ahead. Joined to another. So here's the example of a wife whose husband dies. She can now be joined to another. And that's why Paul starts off with this example, that they are joined together, joined to another, to him who was raised from the dead. For what reason? To bear fruit. Okay? That's why. That's what. Are we bearing fruit? That's the reason that we were to be joined with Christ, so that we could bear fruit. We talked before about being judgmental of different people. One of the things I read said that we're not being judgmental, we're just being fruit inspectors. We're just looking to see what kind of fruit is being born here. So this is the concept of leaving the law, dying to the law, that you might bear fruit for God, which is, we're going to continue to see that this fruit will be to what? To life or to death? to life. Fruit for God is for life. Fruit for Satan leads to the works of evil, result in death, just as it was told to Eve in the garden when the first sin, when Satan's first temptation came about. Death was the result. Okay, verse 5, for while we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in the members of our body, bearing fruit for God? No, bearing fruit to death. Okay, so we see this comparison of leaving the law. You've got a choice: bear fruit for God or bear fruit for Satan. One is for good and life, the other is for evil and for death. And these things were brought to light, which were aroused by the law, or work in the members of our body to bear fruit for death. But now we have been released from the law. How do you get released from the law? Because of death. We've been buried. We have died to the law, having died to that by which we were bound, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. Now we have, again, this reference to the law being written on stone, tables of stone, as opposed to what Jeremiah said, 31:31, this new covenant, this new agreement, not written on stone. It's written on our hearts, written in our minds, which is very, very important down the road here. It's a new, as the book of Hebrews says, it's a better covenant. It's better than all the ones we've had before. This is a new one. It is not the oldest of the letter. The Pharisees were very popular about that. They were not following a righteous, good heart. They were just going by the book, whatever the book said. Now, we're going to talk about the law, hopefully in a little bit more detail, either this morning or next morning. One of the references I read talked about a school that required all of the men students to wear a tie. That was in the things, that you got to wear a tie. Okay? They wear a t-shirt and then put a tie on. Or they'd put a tie tied around their waist. Or just hang it over their shoulder. Well, they were adhering to the letter of the law. They were doing what they were told to do. But was it in the spirit of actually doing what was said? That's a good example of the law of spirit versus the law of the letter. They did what, you got to wear a tie. I got one on. Yeah, but you got it on with a t-shirt. That's not how you wear it. I got on a tie. So you've got to understand that the law was a physical thing. It was written on a physical thing. But the new covenant with God and with Christ is written on our hearts. And if it's in our heart, we're going to wear a shirt, button the collar, and put on a tie. Okay?
You know, Christ said they didn't follow the intent God had for the Jews with the law. He didn't intend for it to be by the letter. He intended for it to be by the Spirit, and to show the Gentile nations how God had prospered and took care of them.
That is exactly correct. And kind of the whole business of the law, the old law versus the new law. And we have to be careful with tradition, because we'll start looking at the letter of the law, not the old law, but even the letter of the New Testament. What defiles a man? What goes in him? Jesus said it's what comes out of you that defiles a man. So it's your fruit. Your fruit. Justified by your faith, good fruit, works from faith. You jump from Romans and the idea of faith saves to to James, who does not say works save, but he says, I'll show you my faith, I'll show you my fruit by my works. You know, they're examples of one another. Okay, so then Paul asks that famous question again. What shall we say then? I'm in verse 7 now. Is the law sin? May it never be. So he always answers that question immediately. Is the law considered to be sin? Well, it came from God. It came from God on the mountain. Moses went up there and wrote it and broke it and had to go back and get it again. And, you know, no, the law is not sin. May it never be. Then, from verse 7 through verse 25, anyway, we get into some pretty wild comparisons here. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had said, you shall not covet. So we go through this idea again that the law was written down, so God actually said, here's what I want you to not do, and here's what I want you to do. So if you did do the things he said don't do, or if you don't do the things he says to do, that was hard enough to say, then therein designates sin. Before you were told, do this, don't do that, then it was just like the law that was given to the Gentiles, pretty much. It was a moral rightness of knowing that you shouldn't steal something, you shouldn't kill someone. I mean, we know that sin existed before the law because we've got examples of it. I mean, duh, Noah. You might remember what kind of shape the world was in there. So obviously sin was in the world, but once it's dictated, then you know. One of the examples I read was when we were all in school, which I vaguely remember, when you went in to take a test, well, going in, you kind of knew, well, do I know this stuff? Or I hope I know it well enough. Do I know it good enough to take this test? I'm kind of thinking I do. How about after the test? What did you know then? You knew then whether or not you knew the information there. So that's kind of the analogy of the law. Once the test was put before you, once the law was given, then you knew what was wrong. I think we're going to talk about the law before we continue with the rest of this chapter, and if we don't finish it, we'll pick up on it next week. Okay, what did the law do? Or what the law did, maybe a better way to put it. Well, verse 7 of chapter 7 says, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had said, you shall not covet. What about chapter 3 of Romans and verse 20? Because by the works of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law becomes the knowledge of sin. So that's one thing that the law did. It brought forth the knowledge of sin. Is this right? Is this wrong? Should I do this? Shouldn't I do that? Look at the law. It will tell you what is good and what is wrong. I'm sorry? Bronson says it established boundaries or requirements and requirements. Another analogy I read was shoulders of the road. If you're driving down the road and you run off on the shoulder a little bit, well, you're still driving down the road, but what does that tell you? I'm not on the path anymore. It's a boundary. I need to get back on the, so that's kind of what the law did. It showed the children of Israel when they were getting off of their duty to God off of the commandments that he had given them. You can run on the shoulder for a while till you come to a bridge or a ditch or whatever, but that's kind of a boundary set to get you back on the road. The law showed sin as what it is, rebellion against God. And what does chapter 7 verse 13 say? Therefore did that which is good become cause for death for me? May it never be. Rather it was sin, in order that it might be shown to be sin by effecting my death through which is good, that through the commandment sin might become utterly sinful. It showed God, it showed God's people that it was rebellion against God, and it was a power to enslave people. It's what the devil used to enslave people. Second thing the law did is it provoked sin. If the law said don't do this and you did that, well, now you're sinning, and the law says that you're sinning. So it caused people to sin, because people are prone to sin or to enslave themselves to sin, which was aroused by the law. Human nature. Hey, don't do that. Don't get in that cookie jar. Don't watch TV tonight. Don't do this, don't do that. What are we going to do? Right in the cookie jar we go. So it's human nature to do what we're not told to do. It's just unfortunate that human nature is that way. But so does that mean that saying don't go in the cookie jar or don't watch TV, that's evil thing? No. So it didn't mean that the law was evil because it gave boundaries, but if you didn't do what the law said, then you were sinning. So to that degree, it provokes sin. But the law is good if used lawfully. 1 Timothy 1:8. I've got it written down here so we don't have to turn there. But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, realizing the fact that law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious. Is the law for people that abide by the law anyway, through the heart? No, it's not. It's for those who are not going to abide by the law. Don't get me started on our governmental situation in the Second Amendment, but the idea of taking guns away from good people that have never killed anybody in their life, what about the bad guys? Are they going to turn in their guns? That's not what we're here to talk about, but I'm just trying to use that as an example. Some of you may or may not agree with me, and I respect that opinion. But law-abiding citizens don't really need the law, do they? They're going to do what's right no matter what. However, it needs to be designated. Law is useful. We know that law is good, Paul says in Timothy. But it's those commandments that cause sin. What did God tell Eve and Adam? Told them both. That tree over there? Well, because the law was given, don't eat it, what did Eve want to do? And what did Satan use to create sin? This is a perfect example of what we're talking about with the law. Satan used God's law. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the law being the root of evil and the law causing sin. It's not saying that the law was bad. It's not saying that the law was not good for what it was intended to do. But even Satan said, oh, you don't have to. God said what? He used that commandment against Eve and Adam, and boom, what happened? Sin / death. pretty elementary example there, but that one's easy enough to understand, right? Questions, comments? Paul even says, okay, I didn't mean to stop and start talking. Bronson is saying that he utilized that law, and that's what we're saying, that he used God's law to provoke the sin. He just took what God said, changed one little word, and Eve believed a lie. He told her a lie, and she believed it. Hook, line, and sinker, all the way. In verses 11 of chapter 7, for sin taking opportunity through the commandment deceived me, and through it killed me. Well, it didn't kill Paul. He didn't die there. Eventually, sin, I guess you could say, caused Paul to lose his life. But up in 7 through 8, I would have not known about coveting if the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. Hadn't said don't covet. Paul says, I really wasn't, I didn't know I was coveting really until the law said don't covet. And then I was very much aware of it and caused me to covet. Now that I knew that it wasn't right to do. Questions, comments? Is this making sense? Okay. At least one person nodded, so I'm doing okay. Who? Okay. One could assume that everything we have today was right there in the garden. Every kind of fruit tree, every kind of animal, every kind of everything. It was the Garden of Eden. Can you imagine, other than heaven, God preparing a place on earth that was as perfect as the garden and all of the freedoms they had? But as I stated earlier, human nature, what are they going to do? The one thing, and I'm just trying to remember back, isn't that the only thing he said don't do? That was the only thing he said don't do. Out of everything. He even said, out of all of the tree, all of the stuff in the garden you can do, all of it, do what you want to do.
He used the ultimate thing that we all think about. He said, not just tempted, but what he said, you'll be like God if you eat of that tree. That was the real key to it. Because he says, he asked her, he tell you couldn't eat of it? He said, couldn't eat of that tree. He said, you won't die, you'll be like God. Well, we want to be like God. And I'm talking about, gee, that's the way we are. Kind of sometimes we want to always be better. Competition, we want to be just like God, but we'll never be like God. You can't be God. That's it. And that was a temptation that actually caused him to make this deal.
And with the example of Christ's, the short example we have of Christ's temptation, we know that Christ was tempted in all things just like us. Sometimes we don't like to think about that, but it wouldn't have worked if Christ had not been tempted in all things just like us. We get the little short example of Christ's temptation, but that was one of the things that the devil used on him. You'll be all powerful, all this stuff, you'll be, Of course, he answered with, "It is written," but bottom line is, Satan, all this stuff's mine already anyway. You're not giving me anything that wasn't mine and is going to be mine. Okay, tempted Paul to covet. We see that's why we have this attitude of the law causing sin. The law's not evil. The law's not bad. It laid out a groundwork for the Israelites, for God's people, and when they stepped over the line, it was sin. Verse 14, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh." Those are two totally different things, right? Goes right back to that written on stone versus written on the hearts. The law is spiritual, but I'm of flesh, sold into bondage to sin. So the law held one captive to sin. If it says don't do it, it says right there. Under bondage. Bondage is slavery. So we see that's one of the things. Justification by law demanded what? Sinless living. If you were going to be justified by the law, you had to go through all of that. Anybody ever read Leviticus? Whew. How in the world were those people going to do all of the stuff that they were required to do, let alone there were so many things to do that they had to have a whole tribe of Levites and different sections of that tribe. Literally, if there were millions of people that left, there had to have been thousands of Levites that it took to keep up with all the stuff that they were required to do. It's impossible to do that, to adhere to all the laws. Even in the New Testament, it's impossible for us to adhere and to be justified without one thing: the grace of God. God's rewards at Christ's expense. Grace. That one needs to stick. We're not going to work ourselves there, folks. We're not going to buy ourselves there. We're not going to do ourselves there. It's the grace of God that makes it possible. It'd be totally impossible. We can't hold up to sin's rules by ourselves. We have to have the strength of God, the strength of the Spirit, the strength of our fellowship in our brotherhood. All of those things is what helps us. Otherwise, we're going to remain a prisoner, a slave of sin. Okay, fourth, the law promised life, but produced death. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became alive, and I died. And this commandment, which was to result in life, proved to result in death for me. For sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. Man, you go back to Leviticus, what does Romans 10:5 say? I wrote that down. For Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on the law shall live by that righteousness. So it's righteousness. It's not the law, even the reference to Moses. What was the result of many of the commandments in the law? What if a child disobeyed his parents? What about unfaithfulness in marriage? The law resulted in death. You break the law, the command was kill them, as opposed to eternal life through the new and better covenant. It brought about death if violated. The law also, I've got written here, says the law left men where they were. It didn't give them motivation to do good. All they had to do was, well, I killed that lamb and I brought in those stuff and we burned them on there. It's okay. I did that. I've done what I was told to do, so now I can basically do anything I want to do. Because I went by the letter, I did the letter of the law. Checking off the list. No motivation. Always going to be in debt. Plus, no way I'm going to do all the stuff that it says in that book. It's just not any way I'm going to be able to pull it off. Okay, the fifth thing, I said that the law left men where they were, gave no motivation. It was an outward influence. I've already used that example of the shoulders of the road. It was an outside influence. They knew they had left the path of duty, but we need a law written on our heart, not on the stone. Mankind needs more than just a law. We enjoy just the law today, and how well do we do in America by adhering to the law? I don't even have television at my house. We just did away with it. No one's adhering to the law. There's no respect for the law. Can you imagine? Anyone in this room imagine a highway patrol or a policeman pulling you over on the road and you taking out a gun and shooting them, or jumping out and running away from the law? And it's like, I don't have a concept for that. So the law is not going to do us any good. Only if there is respect, if it is taken where? To the heart. If you believe that's a good thing and that's the way it should be, or just out of respect for the law. We may not agree with some of the things that the law requires of us, but we have respect enough for the law that we go ahead and adhere to them. Flip over to chapter 8, verse 15. Let's see why I wrote that down. For you have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. Chapter 1, verse 17. For in it the righteousness of God has revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. Our righteousness, our adherence to the law, comes through our faith, through our belief in doing what is right. And that's what Paul's talking about here. The law versus the spirit of the law. Okay, the last thing I've got down here about what the law did or did not do in this case, the law could not provide forgiveness. Hebrews 10, we know what Hebrews 11 is about in the faith, but Hebrews 10 is a biggie. What about the blood of bulls and goats? What could that blood do? It could do stuff, but it couldn't take away sin. No forgiveness through bulls and goats. Let's flip over to Galatians, another letter that Paul wrote. I did these backwards. I don't know why I've got Galatians 3:21 first, that says, is the law then contrary to the promise of God? Just like the questions he asked in Romans. May it never be, for if a law had been given which was able to impart life, then righteousness would indeed have been based on law. What about 2:21? Even better. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. No need for Christ to come if the law was the answer to our salvation. Okay, those are some thoughts about the law. So, I've got a little bit of stuff left, which is probably going to be a repetition of this thing about the law. we got through about 10, I guess, well, through 11. For sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So we see this idea of sin and death through the law. No salvation, no justification. So then, he immediately says, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Now we have the same analogy that I brought reference to before when it says that somebody might die for a righteous man, or even more than that, somebody might die for a righteous and a good man. Well, is that better than dying for a righteous man? Well, in the Greek translations, good, righteous and good, is closer to God than just being righteous. If you're righteous, that's great. But fruit, you need to be good. You need to be able to see the goodness. So we see that analogy here. I just thought that was interesting that it jumped up again. The law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Therefore, did that which is good become a cause of death for me? That question again, may it never be. Rather, it was sin in order that it might be shown to be sin by effecting my death, through which that is good, that through the commandment sin might become utterly sinful. So if I say don't do that and you do that, you've utterly done totally what I said not to do. And I wrote it down and said don't do that. And you did it anyway. Okay. As complicated as some of this is, especially this last part here. For that which I am doing I do not understand, for I'm not practicing what I would like to do, but I'm doing the very thing I hate. But if I do the very thing that I do not wish to do, I agree with the law, confessing that it is good. So now, no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which indwells me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, in the flesh, that is, in my flesh, but the wishing is present for me. But the doing of good is not. For the good that I wish, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want to do. But if I'm doing the very thing I don't wish, I'm no longer the one doing it, but sin that dwells in me. I find the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wishes to do good. So 22 throughout 25 continues the same attitude, and what Paul basically is saying is I'm a righteous person, I'm a good person, I want to do good, but I don't understand. I do the very things that I want to do, that I don't want to do. As complicated as this section is, who can relate simply to that? Do we not all have that goodness and desire in our heart, and then what do? We don't do what our heart says. We don't do what was written on our hearts. We sin. But Paul's saying it's not really us doing it. What is it? It's sin within us. What is synonymous with sin? Starts with the same word, same letter. Satan. It is Satan tempting our hearts to do the things we don't want to do, and we know we're not supposed to do them. But Satan and his power is able to, what did he say? Deceive me. That's the word. Able to deceive us and have us to do the things that we don't want to do. And what is our ace in the hole, so to speak? The grace of God. We sang it last week, right after we had studied it, and I wanted to preach a sermon again from the song leader's pulpit. Grace that is greater than all our sin. It's a good song. That's one we need to be humming while we walk down the sidewalk on the sunny side of the street. It's time. Thanks for your attention. We'll probably move on into chapter 8. I may pick up the last 3 or 4 verses next week of chapter 7. Go back and look in the book. I did not refer to our workbook today. He has chapter 6 and 7 all rolled into one, probably because wanted to get past it. No, I'm teasing. Go back and look at those questions in the book. There's some very good, good information in there that will help us. Thank you for your attention. Okay. Thanks. A bunch.